Hello and welcome to Web Development 101 with Alex Merced. On this show, we'll talk about all the basic concepts of web development in a way that anyone can understand, whether it's front-end web development, back-end web development, and full-stack web development. If you're new to web development, I recommend listening from episode 1 to understand all the concepts from beginning to end. You can also learn more about my own personal projects over there at alexmercedcoder.com. Thank you. Hey, everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and you're listening to Web Development 101. And today what I want to talk about is web components. So this is different than the component frameworks I talked about in the last episode. So the idea is when you're talking about like Angular, Vue, React, those are full-fledged frameworks. So it's not just the ability to create components and assemble your website by components, but they include tools for routing websites, they're all sort of inclusive, okay? In the sense that when you're working within React, you're using, React components work within React, Angular, etc. Now, when it comes to Angular and Vue, there are, at least I think with Vue it's built in. Angular, I think there's tools to be able to take the components you make in Vue and Angular and actually make them web components. So that begs the question, what is a web component? So the difference between sort of a component you make in React, Angular, or Vue versus a quote-unquote web component is that it's non-framework specific. So a web component can exist outside of you working within React, Angular, or Vue. So you could literally create a website purely out of web components, which you then place into your code by including a JavaScript file and then just kind of placing a custom HTML tag in your HTML file. So, and the reason why that's cool is because then you can create components that are reusable. While React components, Angular components, and Vue components are reusable in other Angular, React, Vue projects, you kind of have to stay within that atmosphere. I'm not sure if there's exactly a built-in way or a very clear way of taking React components and making them web components. I'm just not aware of it yet. But I have read up on being able to turn Angular components to web components and Vue components into web components. And Vue, I think, again, has that feature built into it. One of the other reasons why, again, Vue, the one that doesn't have a big company attached to it, keeps growing for a variety of these kind of cool extra features. Now, so theoretically, in the future, you can just create a bunch of web components and use already existing web components and not operate within any framework. And people could use any tool to create web components, and you can still use those components within your project. So in the future of creating sort of single-page applications, it's kind of going in that web component direction, where instead of starting with a Vue project, a React project, or Angular project, you just collect the components from everywhere that work for your project, create the other components you need, and assemble your website. Pretty cool. So what tools are there to create web components? So the difference is you're not working within a framework, you're creating sort of encapsulated web components that can then be assembled into an application. The only one I've actually practically used myself is StencilJS, which is pretty cool. And the premise with StencilJS is that it compiles the code. So when it creates a web component, it really factors in sort of a browser compatibility. So basically what you compile fits all web standards and then you can actually choose sort of what level of compatibility you want when you compile. And then it'll compile that. So that way when you include in your project, you don't have to worry about compatibility. And if web standards change, you just recompile the code. Okay, and newer versions of StencilJS will just be aware of the new standards. You just recompile the component you've already created instead of redesigning the component because the framework has changed. Okay, that's sort of the issue with when I talked about Angular, when they switched from Angular 1 to Angular 2, everyone had to change their Angular code if you wanted to use the Angular 2 features. Here with StencilJS, at least theoretically, the promise is that you basically just make your component, and then as things change, you just recompile it. And StencilJS will recompile it to meet the new standards, making, having to adjust code constantly for compatibility sort of hopefully a thing of the past. Because you just recompile your components every time there are major changes in web standards. Now, Google has its own entrant in sort of the creating a web component world. That's Polymer. There's Bit. There is Svelte. And I think there's one more that's escaping me at the moment. Okay, but there are essentially a lot of tools for creating web components. And again, that's different than, again, a framework. The idea here, you're creating standalone pieces that don't have to be used within a certain encapsulation, while sort of using standard Vue, Angular. So if I were to take a component made in Angular and try to use it in the middle of React without creating sort of an Angular, sort of environment, I'd run into some issues. Okay, different syntax, etc. And then on top of it, as these frameworks change, I'd have to update my components and code to reflect the changes in the framework, versus web components which are rendered down to web standard code. So I don't care about the source code of the web component, as long as the web component does what it's supposed to do. Okay, depending on how the web component is created. So that's the role of web components, just so you're familiar when you hear that term and as things move in that direction. So there's a lot of really interesting technologies that are sort of growing that aren't quite the norm yet. So again, things like WebAssembly, as I talked about in the previous episode, things like web components, and then later on I'm going to talk about GraphQL, which will change sort of the way we query data from the website, from the front end. So lots of cool technologies. The reason why it's good to know these technologies and learn about them is because eventually they will be used more and more. They're growing quickly. So most projects, most jobs that you'll probably find now, you may not be using these particular technologies yet, but you always want to make sure you're future-proofed and you're kind of aware of the evolution, so that way, as you get complete one contract at one job, you're kind of ready to with the skills for the next one. So I'll talk to you guys later. Have a great one and enjoy.